everybody, it's Mike DiLisio, and today I'm going to be covering the solo modes for 5 different games. Many of you know that I am a big solo player, and I'm a part of many reviews here on the Dice Tower, but it's not very often that we discuss those solo modes when games have them in the regular studio reviews. So I felt like I would take some time and go over specifically the solo variants in different games. These may be games we've already reviewed before, they may be games that we have not reviewed, they may be games that we never do in a full studio review. But these are games that I have played solo modes for, and I have my opinion. So let's get ahead and go into it. We're going to do this in alphabetical order, and I'm going to use a common kind of matrix to discuss my thoughts. First up, we've got Biohack. This is a game that has been reviewed on the channel, and I was a part of that review. So the first thing that I'm going to be talking about in all of these games is the winning condition. How do you win as a solo player? Well, in Biohack, you're going to win by hitting a score threshold and meeting some achievements. Specifically in the standard version, you have to get at least 100 victory points, although they're called something different, but 100 victory points, and you have to get 7 animals on your player board of, I believe, the 9 spots. So that's the general condition you need to win. However, they have also added 4 different challenges for some variability in the solo game, where sometimes you are not trying to go for a score threshold at all, but you're trying to meet particular requirements. It's a nice addition to kind of keep the solo mode fresh if you've played it a lot. These give you some other ways to kind of interact with the solo game. As far as the rule book goes, it has a separate section in the back of the rule book dedicated to the solo rules. It's overall good quality. It explains the solo game well, although there were a couple of typos here and there that I noticed, and that actually applies to the entire game's rulebook. It's a translated rulebook and nothing that is game-breaking by any means, but a couple little typos, and I found a little bit of ambiguity about how you handle the downtown tiles. But again, these are pretty minor things. Overall, a fine rulebook. The administration, how much administration does it take for the solo player in this game? And I rank from a 1 to 5 scale from easy to difficult. And so I'm giving this a 2 as far as administration goes. It's a very simple card system that you use where essentially it's going to be blocking spaces. This is a worker placement game, and so these cards really act as blockers for different spaces. And it also helps keep the card market refreshing as well. Something that I think is often essential in solo games and doesn't always get enough focus is that you've got to keep, in a game where there is a kind of cycling market of cards, in a solo game they don't get refreshed as often usually. This takes care of that and does a fine job of it. So, final thoughts. I think this is a solid solo game. It's, I found, not easy to win. There's very much a significant challenge there, but you can also adjust the scores for difficulty. So in your first few solo games, you may find it hard to reach one of the 2 objectives. So, you know, I had situations where I cleared the 100 points, but I was maybe an animal short of meeting that threshold, or vice versa. And so for your first couple of games, until you start to learn the strategies, you know, I think you can adjust that a little bit and make it so that once you are pretty often successful, then move to the regular mode and your skills will have improved by then. So overall, I'm giving this a 7.5. I think it's a really solid solo game and well worth checking out. All right, coming out next in alphabetical orders is Draft and Write Records. This is a game that is essentially a drafting and writing, well, that's what it's called, draft and write. No big surprise there. And in the solo game, the winning condition, there is none. Essentially, there's no win condition. It's simply a score matrix, and there's a bit of a, you know, depending on which kind of tier you fall in, you'll have some kind of a nice little thematic sentence or two about it. I believe that 100 points is the lowest threshold. Below that, they say something like, oh, you need to keep training. So I would consider 100 to probably be the winning condition, although there's technically not really one. As far as the rulebook goes, it's on the back page of the rulebook. I think technically the back page is a player aid, but like back page on the inside. There was some small initial confusion I had over the drawing phase, because that is different than how it works in the multiplayer game, but it began to make sense quickly. I just had to kind of try to envision it in my head. I was having a little bit of trouble with that, but then when I actually had the cards in front of me and I was doing it, I was like, oh, okay, I see what they mean. So not a huge deal there at all. As far as the administration goes, it's a 1. There really is no real administration beyond what's there in the multiplayer game. You're essentially doing the same thing. You could say that Draft and Write Records is almost a multiplayer solitaire game, other than the drafting. But you don't really have that here. It's not really any kind of administration at all. Very simple to do. And for final thoughts, as I mentioned, it feels very similar to the multiplayer solitaire game that it essentially is, except for the drafting. There's no real drafting there. I do wish that instead of just a score matrix, which is fine, but right, and nowadays I think it's teetering on the edge of not being enough. I would have preferred that they add some achievements, things along those lines. I think that that makes a score threshold a little bit more dynamic. Otherwise, it can almost just feel like you are going through the motions a little bit in the solo game when you just have a score threshold. I think years ago that was enough. Now I wish they would go a little bit higher, but still, overall, I do recommend the solo game. I will be giving this a 7 out of 10. Next up, we've got Expedition Northwest Passage. This is a game that is a reprint of a game that came out many, many years ago by the same name, Expedition Northwest Passage. Now, this is an updated version. There have been some changes to the game. They actually call it the HMS Terror Edition to differentiate it. But it has some differences, and one of the main differences is the solo mode has been significantly beefed up. The original version was, it was there, and it was fine. I enjoyed it at the time, but this is a much more robust solo mode for the game. So, as far as the winning conditions go, you have 3 necessary requirements to even be considered to have won the game, and then go beyond that to check for scoring. So you need to be able to discover the Northwest Passage. You need to be able to collect 10 Franklin site points, which is essentially the canoes, okay? And you have to return to Greenland with at least your ship or your sled and at least 1 crew member remaining. If you do all of those things within the number of rounds that are in the game, then you are considered to have won, and you could then go on to scoring, where it gives you a little bit of a threshold. I think they say that if you win, 40 points is considered a good score in the solo game. So the points are there, yes. I don't think that they're very impactful. I think it's mostly about, can you complete those 3 objectives? Because I think that can be tricky. Administration. Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. The rule book. The rule book, this has a 7-page section of solo rules at the end of the rule book. One thing that I really appreciate is that on the front cover of the game, actually I've got it right here, the front cover of the game, they list solo components separately. More games need to do this. If you've got a solo mode that has solo-specific components, put them prominently on the rule book so that people that maybe aren't playing the solo game don't get confused and wonder, what are these components for? I don't see them in the rule book. They've been stuck in the very back under the solo rules, and then it just leads to confusion. So I really appreciate that they did that, and they should be commended for it. I wish more publishers would do that. The solo mode section is very extensive with illustrated graphics throughout. I really feel like this does not feel like an afterthought, the solo variant. It really feels like an integrated part of the game, and that is quite good. There were a couple of small typos I noticed. Again, nothing that led to any real confusion, but it does point to a little bit maybe of a lack of quality control. Where everything else is so good, the small typos do stand out. I do believe that this is a translated rule book. I believe it's originally in French, but I'm not positive about that. All right, for the administration, I'm giving this a 3. There is more to track in the solo game because you've got the addition of these food cubes and these morale cubes. And those are something that you have to kind of be spending and returning. There's just a bit more to keep track of in the solo game than in the multiplayer game, where you really are only considering your crew members and your ship or your crew, or ship or your sled, sorry. But in this one, you do need to keep track of that, and you also need to keep track of following all the steps very carefully and in the correct order, because that can throw things off if you kind of skip some of the steps in the solo game. Final thoughts. As I mentioned before, this solo game feels very difficult to me. Very, very difficult. The voyage cards especially, which are specific to the solo game, can feel very, very punishing in a game that already feels pretty punishing. So I think some people may have an issue with those voyage cards because they are essentially random events. They could just kill a couple of your crew. They could change which areas of the board are frozen and unfrozen. Some pretty impactful things. There are a few positive things as well, but you can really never count on that. You can almost always assume it's going to be something negative. You should at least be planning for it to be something negative and just be pleasantly surprised when it's not. So that is something to consider. It's tough. There are ways to adjust it, I think, because they give you more food and morale cubes than they ask you to use in setup. They say 15 of each in the standard setup. You could just add more of those markers on each, and it would essentially be giving you more actions overall over the whole game. So that is one thing to consider with that. I really enjoy the fact that the solo game obviously is going to play differently than the multiplayer game, because the multiplayer game is not only a survival game, but it's a race game where you're trying to get to the Northwest Passage from Greenland and then return to Greenland first, because the first player to get to Northwest Passage and Greenland is going to get the most points for reaching those. And then there are other things that you're collecting along the way. In the solo game, they give you a thematic explanation as to what you're doing. You're on a very specific type of mission where not only are you trying to chart the course between those two areas, but you're also trying to find out what happened to the Franklin, what was it called? I can't remember. The Franklin Expedition, I think. Yeah, Expedition Point. So this is a solo mode that very much feels like a well-designed, well-developed aspect of the game and does not feel tacked on at all. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10, a really solid solo game. Up next, we have Harmonies. The winning condition in Harmonies is there isn't one. There is simply a score matrix based on suns. The number of suns you have is going to determine kind of how well you did. As far as the rule book goes, there's a half a page at the very end. It's really simple because there's basically no extra rules. There's a slightly different way of getting tiles, although it's essentially the same. It's almost the same game because I think that the main game is, again, quite multiplayer solitaire. Administration It's a 1. It's really nothing beyond the base game. Most of what you're doing in this game is on your personal player board. And so in that way, it feels very much like the multiplayer game, which is head down, puzzle on your own board, okay? The only difference is, well, let me just put that in final thoughts, get out of administration. Final thoughts. The base game, as I mentioned, is basically multiplayer solitaire, head down, looking at your board, with the exception of the tile drafting. That's really the only interaction point in that game, is that you might be looking for specific tiles. Players could even look and see what you're going for, and if they wanted to, they can specifically take tiles that would hurt you. That's really the only interaction. In the solo game, that's not even there, okay? You essentially have always 3 piles of 3 tiles that you can choose from. It takes away any real sense of tension, and I feel like it makes the game feel flat. It removes the only part of the main game that I felt was spicy at all, you know, because again, this is just an abstract puzzle game. I'm not sure it's even an abstract puzzle game that I have a huge opinion of, but I'll save that. We haven't done a full review of it yet in case I'm a part of that. But the solo game, as I said, it just feels flat. I can't really recommend this one. I'm giving it a 5.5. All right, finally, the last game in this list is Harrow County. The winning condition in this game is you have to complete your faction's winning condition before the other 2 non-player character factions meet their winning condition, or before a deck of solo cards runs out. Okay? So you are essentially one faction playing against 2 different factions, and you are trying to complete your winning condition, which is based on objectives, before either of the other 2, or go past the timer, essentially, which is that solo deck. The rule book, it is 2 pages at the end of the book. It is well explained. The one thing I will say about the rule book is that I would have liked more illustrated examples specific to the solo game. The main rule book itself is extensive. I think it's an excellent rule book, although its style of chapters probably doesn't work for everyone. It worked well for me. But it's a very extensive with a lot of illustrated examples. In the solo game, not so much. I would have appreciated more of those. The administration, this is a 4, and it's teetering to a 5. It's right between a 4 and a 5. This game asks a lot of the solo player. It really does. This is a highly asymmetric game where each faction plays significantly differently than the other factions, and has different ways to win. To play the solo game, you are going to have to understand not only how your faction works, which is the Hester faction, but you also have to know how the family guild works, or that group, and the protector. So 3 asymmetrical factions you have to understand before you can even play the solo game. That is asking a lot of solo players, and I think it may be too daunting for some solo players, and I can understand that. However, final thoughts time, I think the juice is worth the squeeze on this one. I'm really impressed with what they did here with this solo game. Somehow, they successfully took a highly asymmetric, very interactive multiplayer game, which, you know, multiplayer, I think 2 is usually how it's going to be played, you know, faction against faction. There are ways to add in with expansions and such other, you know, you can have 3-player game and etc. But I think this is really at heart a 2-player game that they have been able to turn into a solo game that is really compelling, and it retains all of the weirdness and eccentricities of this design. Because make no mistake, this is a weird game. I haven't played anything like it, and the solo game retains that. It's a pretty big trick to pull off, to be able to take a game with this specific design, which is interlayers and locking things and knowing not only how your faction works, and this is in the multiplayer too, but knowing how the other faction works, because it's important that you know how they're going to be trying to defeat you, what their strengths and weaknesses are, etc. That is all kept in the solo game. It does ask a lot of the solo player, but I feel like it's very much worth the effort. I'm giving Harrow County solo game an 8.5 out of 10. I think it is excellent. All right, well, that's going to do it for me with this batch of 5 solo games. I'll be back soon with more solo reviews for you, but until next time, this is Mike DiLisio signing off from the Dice Tower Midwest Annex.
Hey folks, thanks for watching another one of our videos. If you like our videos, if you like our channel, you would love to game with us at one of our conventions. Check out Dice Tower Cruise, Dice Tower East, and Dice Tower West. Fantastic conventions where we play games with wonderful people, a humongous library, and lots of other events and stuff. Also, don't forget to check out our channel, like and subscribe. I'm Tom Bassel.